everyone, and welcome to the DeakinCo Lab workshop on learning in the flow of work, an innovation that is essential to employees and businesses to grow and thrive through continuous learning initiatives. I'm Ash Jones, your facilitator for today's session and Director of Xena Consulting, a learning and development consultancy. I'm delighted you could join us today in what I believe will be a truly inspiring webinar. This webinar is the first in a new series from DeakinCo, where we'll be bringing international and national leaders together in their fields of expertise to share their knowledge and experience, to challenge ways of learning and provide examples of current and future ways of improving lifelong learning opportunities. It's through the sharing of such knowledge and experience that we expose and challenge ourselves to new ideas, concepts and ways of working. And it's with this lens on best practice learning opportunities that brings us together today. Now, today we've brought together 4 talented HR and organisational development leaders to help us explore how emerging trends in work are influencing learning in the flow of work and what forms of innovation are essential to meet current L&D requirements. So, without further ado, let me introduce the panel. First up, we're joined by Kate Reid. Kate is Senior Manager, Culture and Capability at MyState Limited, a major regional financial services group, and she leads developing culture and capability across the organisation. Joining Kate is Damien Woods, Chapter Lead, Learning and Growth at 7-Eleven, a major convenience retailer. In this role, Damien is focused on supporting business performance, ensuring that learning is core to how people work and therefore perform. Our third panellist today is Nadine Castle, a co-founder of the Culture Group. She's passionate about lifelong learning, maximising performance and growing an organisation human capital. Our fourth and final panel member is Glenn Campbell, CEO of DeakinCo, which is an industry leader in offering practical modular workplace learning and development that drives organisational performance. My personal thanks to all of you for being here today to set off this new seminar. So, to start today's webinar, I'm very keen to ask Glenn to summarise what it is we actually mean by learning in the flow and why is it important in today's workforce?
Learning in the flow is a concept that was defined by Josh Bersin and Mark Zhao Sanders in their Harvard Business Review article in 2019. But in short, learning in the flow of work is about the ability for learners to undertake forms of microlearning that enhance their ability to build knowledge as and when needed to enhance skills, but not disrupt the individual workflow capacity.
Great. Thanks, Glenn, for linking that to it for us. Damien, can I ask you to sort of lead on from what Glenn's just said? If this form of learning is the future, the way of the future, how do we encourage our organisations to provide effective micro-learning so that it becomes an integral part of our day-to-day jobs?
It's a great question, Ash. Thank you. Look, it's an interesting one. I think the question about quality content has been well and truly solved now. What we've seen happen, particularly in the last decade or so, is a massive proliferation of access to really high quality, diverse types of learning from the very micro through to the very macro. So at our fingertips today, we have access to a world of knowledge, information and learning, whether that's university courses shared by the big online providers or shorter micro pieces. I think it starts with considering all the various things that are available to us, such as the formal things that you can get through partnerships with digital learning providers to the more informal stuff that we can access all day, every day via platforms and channels that we are probably quite used to using, but maybe potentially not considering them learning channels. So the sort of stuff I'm thinking about, if I talk about the things that I do from my own personal learning perspective, I'm a very avid user of LinkedIn and I'm a very avid user of Twitter, and I get access to thought leaders in my space at my fingertips at moments when I've got free time for it. I think a part of the reason microlearning is so attractive today is the way we work has changed a lot. We're busier than ever. We are working digitally and virtually more than ever. And I go to some of Josh Burson's work about the modern learner. We're sort of distracted. We're looking at our devices numerous times an hour. We've got shorter attention spans. And so what we try and do is to think about how do you build learning experiences and access to learning content that can fit into the way we work. And so for me, when I think about trying to bring this to life at an enterprise, I look for ways that aren't asking for people to change or disrupting what they do too much. So looking for how you build that into how they work already. An example of that would be we're a Microsoft Teams business, so we all work this way on Teams. We collaborate on Teams as well, so we're chatting that there as well. We look for sort of intact teams to say, well, let's groups of people and say, how do we build into that work, the way we work now, little bits of micro learning so that we don't have to deviate from how we're experiencing our work to get our learning at the same point. And so part of that is the behavioural side of to get micro learning built into how we work. It's great if people share because we all do it. We're all reading things, listening to things, watching things these days. The next step is that if I see something that's valuable, how do I share that with other people? And so I'm sort of paying it forward. So a big part of how I think about it is how do you think about the different channels you've got within the work environment to share information, access to people, content, knowledge, and how do you encourage the behaviour? And I think that a logical thing is looking for leaders who are passionate and prepared to be partnering with you and to think about the behavioural side of we want people to behave a little bit differently in how they consider their learning and consume their learning. So they're some of the things I think that are really important.
Great kickoff. Thanks very much. Nadine, did you want to add anything to that? What are your tips and tricks?
Yeah, I think it's the defining the enablers within a business that makes the real difference here. So we've got technology, we've got gamification, we've got great learning systems now. And as Damien said, you know, the content solution's already been ticked off, but how do we get it close to the work? How do we integrate it into our work and really defining within organisations what those key enablers are, I think is critical. And I also agree with Damien's point around the role of leaders. So how do we get a bit of skin in the game in terms of how leaders coach learning through reflective practice, set up that psychological safety within their team so people can experiment and learn through that on-the-job integrated piece, but also reflect on that and embed that kind of learning practice into just how they work and how they operate and how they behave. And I don't think it's new. You know, I've been reflecting back on my old days back at when I was at Coke, which was, 15 or 20 years ago, I don't know, a few years ago now. And, you know, we did things like that. We ran, we had short hits of training for managers to put through line leaders. What we have now, though, is technology to enhance that. And I think that's the great gift of modern technology these days. But I don't think the concept is new. It's just that it's being amplified now because of the pace of work and our busyness that we can't go to traditional off the job work anymore, off the job learning.
That was great. Thank you. Kate, did you want to add anything to the great narrative that's happened so far?
Yeah, thanks, Ash. I think when I think about learning in the flow of work, I really think about it through a human lens in terms of how do we integrate learning into people's practical realities. So it's sort of a little bit like brushing your teeth. You don't think about, I have to brush my teeth. It's a thing I have to do every day. It's just learning in the flow of work for me is really about how do we integrate it so that people, it's embedded into our workflows. I like the point made by Nadine in terms of leaders, because in our business, leaders are really key to helping people prioritise learning. I think in terms of how do we do this, we've got to get learning on the agenda so it's just part of what we do. It's not off the side of our desks. It's just integrated into the way we work. And I think aligning both the learner needs and the organisational outcomes are really key as well, because then we know what we're learning is actually adding value and it's improving the individual, but it's helping the organisation perform as well.
Fantastic. Nadine, can I ask you, following on from that, because that's a beautiful segue, why is this such a critical innovation in the ways in which we're learning?
I think it's about the context in which we're working and where the future of work's going. That's why it's so critical. The speed in which we work, the intense pressure that the workforce is under now. I think you've got the overlay of COVID and the impacts of that on organisation from a performance perspective. That all drives down to individuals. So to be at the top of your game, learning is a critical component of that. It's a critical component when we think about our performance in our workplace. And the other element is our workforce mix has changed. And it's really important to recognise that. So we've got a multi-generational workforce now. We've got multilingual workforce. We've got gender balances that we need to focus. We've got disabilities that we need to bring into the workplace more. And I think being able to be innovative around learning to address all of that richness of diversity of our workforce now is kind of really critical to make sure that we're creating on the job, in the moment, that accessible, adaptive, psychological, safe environment.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, all of you, for such a great kickoff to the webinar. Kate, what are the key drivers in the way individuals learn within your organisation, do you think?
It's building on what Nadine said. I think in our organisation, post the pandemic, we're all working really differently. So, for us, as Nadine said, we've been in the game a long time. There's certain foundational elements to learning, but I think what's different now is our workforce is just working differently. We're using technology more. We've got much higher levels of digital literacy. We've introduced a lot of automation, which is great from a point of view of making things more reliable. But it means that our employees need to think differently in terms of, well, if I'm going to be ready for the future, I need to learn differently, because then, I'm really thinking about learning differently because I've got to reinvent myself. We've got to be able to upskill people, and we've got to be able to do that on the job. So that there's not time, as Nadine said, there's not time to just go off and do a 3-day course. I've got to have exposure to stuff so that, we can retrain employees and we can upskill them and really do that where we've got people in different locations and, working with different demands.
Great, thank you. I was wondering, Nadine, as you're a consultant in this space, what's your take on what Kate's just said?
Oh, okay, I agree with Kate. I think that what I'm seeing across multiple organisations is there are the ones that are at the head of the game that are really driving learning as part of their DNA in an organisation, but there's still a lot of different workplaces where that becomes a little bit more challenging. And I think it goes back to, I really like what Damien said up front, where is that blend of learning from being an organisational accountability holistically to being my own accountability, and how do I bring my own learning into it is another key element that we need to be thinking of. How do we create that culture of lifelong learning, again, which is not a new concept, but how do we make sure as we are working from home, that blur of work and life, how do we make sure that our learning, stays the same and is dialed up in this new world?
Great. Glenn, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think, look, certainly the digital has become a benefit for us. It gives us greater access to a lot of things, but there's also a flip side to it in that it can start to look overwhelming. Where do I go? Where do I start to get the right sort of content to learn what I need to do? Whether that's through, the need to reskill or to upskill, and certainly what we're seeing is, the bulk of growth in learning is going to happen during our career, more so than it used to in past generations. What sort of starts to become really important then is, how do we skill ourselves to know what's good content and what's not good content? And part of that is almost the need for us to start to learn how to learn. It becomes much more important when there's such a plethora of information available to us. The other, I suppose, side to that is around looking at what are those things that do impact on what we're, the way that we work. And everything is becoming, change is becoming a lot, I don't want to use the well-worn phrase of change is the new normal or new constant, but everything is evolving a lot faster. Even if we look at the industrial revolutions, they're getting closer and closer. People are starting to talk about Industrial Revolution 5. We're still in 4. Let's can we at least get out of that one? So these are the things that impact on us, and the more that we can equip ourselves and our staff to adapt to those changes, whether it's technology or a global pandemic or whatever other externality comes in, the more we can equip our staff to respond and cope with those impacts, the better we all become.
Brilliant. Damien, I think you'd probably want to add to that.
Yeah, look, I really like that point that Glenn's making about change. And I think about some of the stuff that I've done where I'm working now and where I've worked previously really focuses on that from the individual perspective. I think the most valuable asset anyone can have in their career these days is their ability to learn new things and learn new things quickly. A lot of research today around the shelf life of skills suggesting they're getting a lot shorter, and that for a lot of people, the work that they do today, in 5 or 6 years' time, half of the skills they need today will be obsolete at that point. So there's a very important mandate from an individual perspective to keep yourself current and relevant. And that's something that everyone owns themselves. I think there's also an element of businesses trying to help provide that context for people as well. And I think of some really good examples that I've seen in the last little while of enterprises taking a view of that. If you look at Amazon, for example, they're automating their warehouses out completely, and they know in 2 or 3 years' time, they won't need people in their warehouses anymore. A couple of years ago, they saw that coming. And so what they said to their people was, we're going to invest 700 million, I think was the figure, in reskilling. So the job that we need you to do today, we won't need you to do that in 5 years' time, but we'd love to keep you and love for you to do something different. Let us help you get there. So, and I think there's a really important mandate for businesses to try and take that point of view about, let us help lead you where we think you need to get to. Because I think the flip side of that is a traditional business, we know lower level activities will be automated out, and a lot of people will be displaced if they're not reskilling along the way. They'll wake up one day and say, well, the machine does most of my job, so I'm not needed here anymore. And that's a very confronting thing for people to have to experience. But I've seen that happen a lot, particularly in large organisations. So I think that approach to that question that we should ask ourselves is, am I changing fast enough to keep up with the pace of change in the world around me? We need to ask that ourselves, and I think businesses have a job to try and provoke that kind of thinking with their people, and then provide the methods and tools for them being able to upskill and reskill. So I think it's a really important thing, and I think it's back to Glenn's point about that pace of change now is so fast that we need to all be doing that much more efficiently.
A fabulous answer. So building on from that, Damien, if I can get you to kick off the next question, this continuous and fast disruption, let's bring the pandemic into the equation here. How much is that going to affect or alter the way in which we get advanced workplace continuous learning?
I actually think it's a remarkably useful opportunity. One of the things that has been a challenge for a lot of businesses is digital literacy with their people, and from numerous perspectives. So I've worked in banking, and the challenge there was wanting customers to move to digital channels to interact with the bank. And what they realised was a lot of their staff weren't au fait enough with technology to recommend how customers did that. So they needed to build the digital literacy of their people. Many businesses confront that challenge as well. What we've seen during the pandemic is a lot of people have been dragged potentially kicking and screaming into the digital and virtual world where they never needed to be before. All of a sudden in March last year, we all ended up at home and we had to start working like this, and we had to get familiar with technology. What I saw when that was happening, running a large learning function in a bank, was we ran 3 sessions a day for weeks and weeks and weeks on how do you use the basic technology like Teams and OneDrive and different collaboration tools. So there was this massive upskilling exercise so that people were able to work remotely and virtually. I think the benefit of that is we have done enormous things around building people's digital capability in the last 18 months. And so the opportunity is for us to leverage that and bring that into other parts of how we work, and learning and work should be very close together. We've talked a lot about the intersection between technology and learning. Tech is a great enabler. It's a fantastic enabler, but it comes with tech's useless if you're not using it in the right way. And so I think we need to think about the opportunity we've got to say, well, what additional tech skills have our people built in the last 18 months, and how do we utilise that from a learning perspective? So I think I talked a bit before about Teams as a channel for collaboration and sharing as much as it is for doing, meeting people and talking like we do here. So piggybacking what people have had to pick up and accelerating the benefit of that, I think, is a massive opportunity.
That's absolutely fabulous. Thank you. So we've looked at the pandemic and we've looked at technology. I'd like to turn the lens slightly to look at culture and the importance of that within the workforce learning environment. Nadine, did you want to kick off with your thoughts?
Oh, look, my business is called the Culture Group, so I'm all over. This is a heart-paced thing for me. I'm passionate about culture, and I think it's absolutely critical. We've throughout this, we've talked about a whole number of things like psychological safety, like leaders enabling learning. All of this relates to the culture that we're trying to create. They go hand in hand. If you're wanting to create an organisation and a workforce that is continuously learning, you have to ingrain that into the culture of how you work, how you perform, how you reward, all of those elements. So it's a systematic piece. It's the ecosystem that an organisation works within. And we did a piece of research just before the pandemic hit, and it was actually one of the things that came up. There was a couple of elements around learning. One is what we learn. So it's not just the skills, and both Jamie and Kate talked about this. It's about not just the skills for now, but it's the future-based skills that we need, and having organisations starting to think about that because that's their culture. They're future-focused. The other element of what the research told us was about the ownership, and the ownership of learning sitting with us as individuals. And I think, the pandemic itself has had so many negative elements, which we all know, but there's always positive components. And the positive disruption has been, as Damien said, getting us using technology quicker than maybe what we would normally want it to be. But that's been a great enabler. But also for individuals to think about their careers, because some people's careers and jobs have been hugely affected over the last 18 months, and they've had to retrain, reskill, rethink about not just their job, but what's next, what's their career going to look like. Personally, myself, I ended up doing a certificate in mental health, and I probably wouldn't have done that if it hadn't have been through a pandemic, but went back to school, did the night learning. There's some lessons learnt around online learning around that, but that's another story. But it's great to see that, organisations like DeakinCo, the universities are providing that, disrupting what they're doing in terms of offering much more accessible education to people. So I think all of that links back to a learning culture. It's not just the organisation, but it's the individual's learning culture as well.
And it's great to hear how each of you have also been walking the walk and expressing the ways in which you're undertaking learning during this time. Glenn, I think that was a good segue over to you from Nadine in terms of what DeakinCo has been doing around cultural builds, or the way in which culture is embedded within workplace learning, if you wanted to elaborate.
One comment I think I'll bring on first after Nadine has said that. And one of the measures I think around does an organisation have a learning culture? And that's the way it views learning and development from a financial perspective. And it's probably rare that I lead things with a financial lens, but anyway, I will. Is L&D viewed as an expenditure line or an investment? Because in hard times, if we continue to invest in our people, that is a true sign of a learning culture. If when we get to hard times we go, right, we've got to cut costs, L&D goes, that's not a learning culture. Learning should be treated the same as product development, the same as our marketing efforts and the technology we use to develop our product. So I think that's a really big, important first part. The second is, and certainly what we've seen, is the different ways that organisations have been responding to the pandemic. I think without a doubt people have adopted online methods of learning for L&D. And there's some pretty shocking experiences of the way that can be delivered, as perhaps Nadine was pointing out about her certificate for. But there's also some really great ways to do it. And because it's not about just taking what you did in face-to-face and putting it online. For us at DeakinCo, we only have 2 clients left that really have a very strong preference for face-to-face learning, and they're not really doing anything at the moment because of that. Every other client we've got in Australia and India have absolutely adopted online learning as a methodology. And the way that we approach this is quite different. What we've actually done at DeakinCo is to look at learning in a modularised fashion that is 90 minutes or 2 hours. And the reason we do that is that no matter how sort of interactive we can make an online session, the reality is we're still sitting in front of a screen. And that's really drawing and quite exhausting to do. Yes, you can do it longer than that. And look, we've done 3 hours, but that short period of time is good. And the benefit is, if you can then get to face-to-face, it's much easier to take those smaller modules and bring them into a face-to-face environment than it is to do it the other way around. We've also looked at the way, and this isn't just because of the pandemic, but the way we design programs is about how you interact with, engage with the learning materials, and also apply that learning in the workplace. So we design things around 4 elements. The first element is around the learning material. The second element is, how do we engage with that learning material in for want of a better term, the webinar. Things like Slido, things like breakout rooms. There's a whole lot of stuff that we can actually do that we would have normally done in a different way in face-to-face that we can still do online. And the third, and I think the most critical part, is actually this third element, which is about how do we apply that learning in our workplace, whether that's through simulations, case studies, live challenges. That's the important thing. It's not enough in a workplace to just learn something new. You know, we've got to actually apply that. And that's the way, and applying through trial and error and through success, but also through failure. They're the ways we learn. And then the final part, that final fourth element, which we have as a bit of an optional one, is the assessment. But again, we do it through an experiential-based assessment. That's the only method of assessment we do at DeakinCo. We are assessing the experience of the individuals in their workplace, and that's what assessment should be about.
Great, thank you. And I know our other two panellists want to kick in on this particular theme. So, Damien, you had your hand up, so over to you, Damien.
Thanks, Ash. Look, I just wanted to pick up on something that Glenn had said about the thinking that needs to go into creating great virtual, online or digital learning experiences, and that it's a different skill set than we've previously applied. Implicit in that is, therefore, learning people need to grow a different skill set, and they need to be really, when I talked about needing sort of digital literacy in the business, it might even suggest that you need to scale that up within the learning function or the learning people in your business to be designing experiences and executing and then measuring them in a different context and a different environment. So the challenge there for learning leaders and for learning professionals is, what does your skill set look like? Are you really clear on what great looks like, and the different tools that you have at your disposal and how you use them to engage, etc.? Because I think that's so important today. And, I'm fascinated by technology. I love to try and stay up to date with it. And my biggest fear is it moves so fast that I can't. And I try to build into my team's expertise that can help me try and stay up to date with it as well. I've been lucky along the way to have some really bright digital natives who are always coming up with bright new ideas about how we use tech that we already have, or new tech that can make the digital and virtual experience a really good and a really engaging one. So the challenge there is, have we got the right skill set as learning professionals today to be doing that? And if we don't, how do we build them really quickly? So I thought it was a really nice points you were making there, Glenn, and it sort of led to what about our skill set. And I love that Deakin is doing and thinking about that as well. And I think for people in industry, it should be high on the agenda.
Fantastic. Yep, the role of digital literacy, incredibly important. Kate, what did you want to add?
Ash, I just wanted to pick up on the point about culture, but in reference to what Glenn was saying about assessment. So how do we draw this long bow between this very intangible thing to something really tangible? And I think one of the things that is changing, and we've noticed it in our business, because when we think about culture, yes, it's the way of doing things. It's, what do I need to do to fit in around here? And, coming from our organisation where we've got quite a passive culture, we've needed to give people permission to go and learn and make learning a priority. And we've created certain things to, put things in place to say to people, no, this is really important. And whether it's an online learning platform that you can do self-paced in your own time, whether it's a leadership program where we carve out specific time to say to people, no, this is really important. I think, pulling through back to that commercial element, yes, we've got culture. We want to create learning as a priority. We also know that culture and leadership drive performance. So for us, developing our leaders is really key. And we've done that in partnership with Deakin. And I think one of the exciting things that we've started to see really differently from anything that I've experienced before is, okay, you go off, you do your immersive workshop, but we've actually embedded action learning or innovation projects into our program. And our leaders, we've had cohort 1, we're now in cohort 2. They've come up with some really great things that have actually lived beyond the program. So it's given people real life experience. But then I think the key is seeing our leaders really develop that self-awareness and build their confidence in a space of, how do I lead and develop people and, drive strategic results? And we're starting to bring this in day to day in terms of, you're already doing this stuff. Well, let's go to someone like Deakin and get an independent assessment where we can use micro-credentials to say, you don't need to go off and do an MBA. We don't have the time or money to invest in that. As an organisation, we want people to feel really good about what they're doing and feel really confident. So we've been able to, pick up this leadership program, partner with Deakin to get these micro-credentials. But as a business, we've got something that's real for us. We're solving real problems in our business. So I just wanted to pick up on that point because I think it's really key in terms of, technology, as Damien said, enables learning. But the future of work is really human, and we're thinking about skills and mindsets as well. So how do we bring all that together? And, I think there's some really great innovative ways that, universities and commercial organisations are partnering together to really make that happen.
Thanks, Kate. What a great example of learning in the flow. Fantastic. And I can see that Nadine's moving there and shaking. She really wants to engage in that, a response to that human element, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the human element. And also, Kate, what you said around the passive culture and what, we talked about enablers in terms of technology, but what are the capability enablers that do we need to embed in our people, whether they're leaders or individuals, to set us up for the future of work and that adaptability that we need. So things like sense making. So learning's easier to get to, easier to do. We've got access everywhere. But how do we sense make? How do we make sure that we're building capability around sense-making skills? How do we embed that then back into the workplace? What about social competence and social connectivity? How do we drive that? All those humanistic elements that in a future of work where it's not streamlined, it's ambiguous, how do we make sure that we're building that so we don't have passive cultures? We have very active learners, active organisational cultures.
Fantastic. And Glenn, I'm hearing those employability skills and, I was wondering if you wanted to share anything from the Deloitte Access Economics report or add into that comment.
Yeah, absolutely. There's two types of skills, broadly speaking. There's technical skills or, that term I really loathe, hard skills. And then there's the other term I really hate, which is the other set of skills, soft skills or human-centered skills. And in fact, it's the human set, machines, technology alleviates and can adopt and do things better that are process-driven and more logical in nature. It's the illogical things, the randomization, it's the human-centered skills, things like critical thinking, problem solving, communication, innovation. They're the sort of skills that computers cannot do. We can't automate those. They're the human skills, and they're the skills that don't, well, yes, they change, but they become a constant in our life and through our work. And being able to focus and build our staff up with those sets them up for success. We in a couple of years ago, every sort of 2 years, we put out partner with an external organisation to actually look at a hot topic that's going on in the world of business and around people. And the last report we did 2 years ago was with Deloitte around this one I think goes back further than that, but we were looking at what are the skills that are most in demand across different industry verticals. And every single one of those across, I think we looked at 18 industry verticals, the top 3 skills in every single one were human-centered. So yes, there's a lot of talk and there's a real big importance on technical skills and digital literacy and adopting new technology. But the constant throughout time are those human-centered skills. And so how we train and enable people to practice and improve on those skills is really important. And if you think about the way we go about employing people, we're looking for people that have actually got experience in critical thinking or in problem solving, or people who have a track record as an innovator. We're not looking for people that have a track record in learning how to innovate. And we should be looking and applying that same sort of mindset to the way we look at learning and development in our organisations.
It's brilliant. This has been a great conversation so far. So I think we've got time for me to pose one more question to the panel before we move to the Q&A, which I see we've got a number of questions. Sorry, as I turn to the side here, it's because my questions are coming up on a different device. So look, we've touched on, and I think Kate actually really started this conversation beautifully with the measurement of the projects that have been put into play within your area. So I'm going to throw it open to the panel, and feel free to hold your hand up and jump in. How important is measurement in terms of the success of learning and development, and how do we ensure that we get robust measurement across these various different initiatives that we're talking about?
Look, I think measurement's critical. I also think it's extremely difficult because you can't be sort of single dimensional. We did this learning initiative and we saw this business result on the back of it. I think we've got to be more sophisticated than that. But depending on what it is you're doing, I think you can get relatively targeted. For example, I think you've got to start with the business problem you're trying to solve for. And I think that's always important in learning. If you're not solving business problems, then what are you spending your time on? If you can be really clear on the business impact you're trying to have, measuring that becomes a little bit easier. And I think it does become a little bit horses for courses. I think one example that in a learning initiative that we've worked on where there was a very clear business metric was a customer conversations one in a financial institute where our data suggested if the conversations were of a particular nature, there was a particular business outcome that we believe would be better on the back of that. And so we built the learning initiative around how do you have that exact customer conversation. We're going to baseline today, and they're going to look at the impact of that with a discrete population. And so we were able to demonstrate post the learning initiative, there was an uptick in the business outcome you're looking for. So I think measurement is critical. It's difficult, but I think it also needs to be it needs to hang off the business impact that you're trying to have with whatever it is you're working on.
Fantastic, Glenn, Kate.
Yeah, the more that we can place, we can see essentially an assessment that's based around experience, the better it is. And Kate talked about the micro credentials that we do at Deakin. And they're experiential. The ones that we do through DeakinCo are experiential-based assessments. So what we're looking for is evidence that the individual has applied the learning at a certain level within the workplace. And there's a whole variety of ways that we can use this as both a return on investment and a measure of performance improvement. In the financial services sector, I know Damien's worked in this area, in this field before. He's mentioned that. We have a number of financial services clients, and post Royal Commission and other different investigations in within the industry with either individual institutions or a group of, we're seeing a change amongst the clients that we have in the Big Four in particular, of changing the way of not wanting to see learning as a tick and flick or a response to a Royal Commission as a tick and flick exercise. They're wanting to see real change embedded within the bank. So we have a way of looking at non-financial risk management, of how do staff pick up and identify risk? How do the other areas around professional ethics, how do we get and empower staff throughout the entire bank to identify ethical behaviour and demonstrate that they can practice it? So it's one element is the training, but the other part is then how do we assess that? And that's really important. And that's what our institutional, financial institution clients are looking at, is using those credentials that they can then go back to the regulator and say, not only have we trained our staff, but we've now been able to use an independent third party to validate that our staff are applying that learning and applying a higher standard of capability when it comes to risk management, ethics, or whatever other capability it might be. And that's just one of the examples that we've used. And, you know, in Kate's situation, that was a very different reason. It wasn't a Royal Commission response of the program that we did. But again, it was about how do we demonstrate that our leadership has changed? How do we demonstrate that our leadership capability has improved for the betterment of the organisation?
Fabulous.
Yes.
Absolutely powerful.
Can I add to that, Ash?
Please do, Kate. Yes.
Yeah, I think when I think about measurement, there's the qualitative and the quantitative, but there's also the short term and the long term. And I think, you know, back to Damien's point, we think about measurement of is this learning driving growth in our business? You know, there's a whole lot of things that we can measure there, but also is it driving a change in capability, and whether that's individual capability or, you know, team capability. But also then we start to think about what's the impact on our culture. And we've, you know, to Glenn's point, lots of institutions in financial services are measuring their culture, and there's definitive ways of doing that now, which is really great. But that's a very slow moving beast. You don't measure your culture every day of the week. So, you know, for us learnings, it is tricky, like Damien said, to be able to say, you know, oh, we're spending this money, how do we show this uplift in capability, versus actually there's different channels that you can take. And some of them, we can have immediate, thumbs up, that was great training, we've got great satisfaction levels coming out of that course, versus, well, what's the more systemic stuff that we want to measure in terms of how is our culture different? You know, are we seeing things move? And, you know, what else is happening in our system that tells us that this is working?
Fabulous. Now, because I'm cognizant of time, I am actually going to throw the first question, if that's all right, to you, Nadine, and move on to the Q&A so that our audience actually gets to ask some of their questions. So I'm just reading the first one, and they're coming up in order of hits on them. So this one is the most popular at the moment. What examples have you seen where technology has successfully enabled or even institutionalized reflection, both in the moment and after the moment? So the role of reflection and perhaps technology that can be used to undertake that. And I'll throw it to Glenn afterwards because I know he's got a very practical example as well. But please do kick off, Nadine.
Yeah, look, I think reflection's a critical element of learning, and it's a really great question to think about systematically. How do we do that? And I think it is that. It's how do we embed that in all of our elements of our learning cycle. So not just from a personal perspective, personal reflection as a practice, but also how do we build that into what we do. I think it's a tough one. I think it's a tough one when you link it to technology, because it's the humanistic part of it, and we've talked about that. That's the part where you have got some great technology to deliver content, but then how do you sense make, reflect on it, and share stories? So for me, a big piece around reflection is story sharing, and building that into what we're doing, how we're sharing our knowledge, our experience, and our application of learning. I don't think I've got an example specifically. One of the other panelists may, but for me, it really is looking about building in it into the life cycle of your learning journey.
Thank you. Glenn, did you want to add this practically, perhaps?
Yeah, look, first I'll say there's actually a great quote by John Dewey, and I might be paraphrasing this a little bit, but the quote is, "We do not learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience." A hugely powerful quote by a very astute and intellectual man. Now, the reason I say that is that we actually incorporate reflection as one of the most powerful ways that we use in our experiential-based assessment model. Now, we use technology. Our assessment model is completely online. And the other advantage of being able to incorporate technology with reflection is the ability, in our case, what we do is we get people to respond in writing. The ability to document your reflection rather than just thinking and reflecting on it in your own mind is really important. So reflection is one of the best learning methodologies that we have at our fingertips. Being able to document the reflection is the second part. And that's important. Once you've documented it using technology, whether that's through a video journal, we could use a manual journal or a written document journal, we can come back to that time and time again. And we use it as one of the most critical elements to our own way of assessing people's practice.
Fabulous, thanks. Kate?
Oh, yes, Ash, I was just going to add, I think technology is really useful for reflection. I think Nadine already hit on it with, sharing stories of success. In our organisation, we've got a couple of spaces on WebEx where people are always like, hey, I got this thing today and I've got this and this is how I'm doing it. And, it's creating a conversation in our business, and it's not just about collaboration, but it's about, what's working, and let's do more of that. But I think the other thing that I personally experienced recently was going through our leadership program and doing the credentials. And as Glenn said, there was an opportunity to write, which if you're that way inclined, if you're that sort of learner, that's a really good, way to process your thoughts and articulate, this is my experience, this is what I do, hey, Deacon, am I doing it right? But also, and it was really daunting when I did it. You had to actually talk to a camera and then talk about it, online. And it was a completely different way because the reflection is normally in your head. And potentially sometimes you're having a coaching conversation with someone, but when you're actually talking to a camera and using technology and then thinking about what do I do, it was daunting at first, but at the end of the process, it was really great. And then being able to go back and talk to your colleagues at work about, did you do that thing and how did that work? And so again, then you're building on it all the time with, it's technology, but it's bringing that human element to it again in terms of, I get to process this and I'm doing it in a safe space. I'm doing it in my home office. But yeah, it was a really, really powerful part of the program in terms of the reflection, but using technology in a completely different way.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that input. Damien, I'm going to throw the next question to you to kick off, which is, with many discussions about screen fatigue and the blurring of homework boundaries during work from home, do you believe microlearning needs to have protocols over when and how people access it?
Gee, that's a great question. It's a tough one to answer, isn't it? Look, if I approach it personally to start with, the screen fatigue problem is real. We're spending so much more time doing this than we've ever done before, and it's draining. I think in the end, the amount of time we dedicate to microlearning is a personal choice. And the challenge I would have there as well is, microlearning doesn't have to be screen time either. It can be all sorts of different things. It can be a conversation, it could be listening to something, it could be watching something, it could be reading something, it could be trying something. So I think I would answer that by saying we've all got to find our own way through juggling work, home, learning, but expand the thinking a little bit about what micro is and when micro moments of learning are. It's not just using technology. That certainly helps it, but it can be lots of other things as well. Do we put protocols in place for it? I'm not sure. I'd probably err on the side of saying no, in that let people make up, find their own way through that. But I'm interested in what other panellists think about that one. That's my personal view. Yeah,
and I'd probably concur with that. I'd say it would be a And no, I mean, part of what we've been talking about today is about taking accountability for your own learning. That's part of it, self-manage, self-monitor around when it's a good time to lean into those micro moments of learning and when to lean out versus putting more rules and restrictions. This is about lifelong learning, your own journey. So how do you take accountability for that yourself would be my thoughts.
Beautiful. Kate?
Yeah, the thing I would add, Ash, is if I think about it from a motivation point of view, we know from self-determination theory that there's three elements that are going to push people's buttons, and there needs to be a degree of autonomy. Like, people need choice in their learning, in order to really want to engage with it. So I think putting criteria feels a little bit awkward for me because, we want to give people that choice and autonomy. I think where the criteria comes in, though, is in terms of that motivation element on the competence or the value that they pick up from this learning experience. There's so many, as Damien suggested earlier, there's so many different platforms now, and, we can curate content differently and we can talk about what's quality, what's not. But if you know you're learning something that's going to help you in your job, you're going to be more likely to do it. From the organisation's point of view, okay, you might put boundaries and say, oh, it's only 1 hour per week that you're allowed to do this in work time. And, we can't just have a whole lot of people just online doing learning and not doing their jobs. But as long as there's a link to the competence that you're gaining, and, if that's, like Nadine said, if that's something where you go off and you retrain and you do something that interests you, that's going to benefit you. But I think the third thing from a motivation point of view is that relatedness or that connectedness. It's how do we not lose that human element to our learning and not have technology get in the way of human interaction. So, we still want to make sure that, and one of the examples that we do at MyState is we've got a community of practice in change management. So it's a social learning forum. It's you can join whether you're in New South Wales, Victoria, or, Tasmania. It doesn't matter where you are, the learning can happen. But I think those three things are really key in terms of, do I have choice? Am I adding something of value? And am I doing it with other people and humans? Because that's what gets us out of bed every day.
Fabulous. Look, thank you so very much, Kate, Nadine, Glenn and Damien. This has been absolutely fabulous. And I think the calibre of this first webinar is indicative of the fact that we have about 15, 20 questions waiting down the side here for the audience to ask you further questions on what is a really incredibly important topic. So I'd also like to thank the audience very much for joining us, and I hope that you agree that it has been a fabulous session and that you've gotten something out of this that you can take back to your own organisations and perhaps either practically implement or be able to talk to others in the ways in which you can implement some of these amazing ideas. Please do watch out for further communications in regard to the next webinar series. DeakinCo will very much look forward to welcoming you again. In the meanwhile, everyone have a great day. And again, panellists, thank you very much for your time. It's been fabulous.